The war in Afghanistan may be over, but the fighting in American politics about it lives on. This time on Poll Hub, the messy withdrawal of American troops reminds us that a majority of Americans have long supported the pullout of U.S. troops. But will that change now? Then the census data is out, and America is changing in potentially very significant ways. There is a lot here. We're going to dig into it, plus a very fun fact from a very long time ago from Lee. That's a lot of L's. Well, lots to do, so let's get to it. And hi, everybody. Welcome to Poll Hub. I'm Jay DeDapper.
And I'm Barbara Carvalho.
And I'm Lee Miringoff.
We have seen some truly incredible scenes over the last week, 6-7 days, as the pullout of U.S. troops from Afghanistan has turned into a messy situation compared by many people to the fall of Saigon and the helicopter on the roof of the U.S. Embassy and people climbing up a ladder. We've had similar shots, or different, but similar ideas with people running down the runway, clutching to the outside of a U.S. Air Force jet. And while there's a lot to talk about with regards to the withdrawal from U.S. troops from Afghanistan, one of the things that we focus on here, obviously, is public opinion. And one of the things that I think has been noted that is very interesting is that, by and large, both President Trump and President Biden, both of whom moved to get troops out of the U.S. Troops out of Afghanistan, largely had public opinion behind them to end this war. But is that going to change? What do we know now? Very little polling right now, but what do we know now about what might change?
We've seen a couple of polls. We've seen a YouGov poll, which is with The Economist, which is an online poll. Also, the Morning Consult political poll, which is again a new methodology type poll. But I think what they are showing, and I suspect we'll be seeing as well for some of the other polls that are likely to be tracking public opinion during this time, during the event, during the visuals, is two things. One, I think support overall for withdrawal has somewhat waned. And so it is not as much of a consensus as we have seen in the past, both during the Trump administration and Biden's early tenure. But the other thing I think we are also seeing, and it's I don't know how much it is just from the visuals or just the debate and discussion that's going on, is that we're seeing the issue again becoming very, very politicized. And Democrats, holding firm to withdrawal, and Republicans now, beating the drum to perhaps not move as quickly. I haven't seen any polling data yet that suggests that the U.S. has there's strong public opinion for the U.S. to send additional troops or to continue or strengthen its involvement in Afghanistan, but certainly we have seen the politicization of the issue during this very intense time.
Yeah, I was just going to add that that's just lots to say on this. First of all, on the polling side of it, as far as public opinion being set, this is a moving target. This is an event that's unfolding. And you have to watch for polls that are very close to the events themselves. They have a newsworthy value because you can sort of get in on the same news cycle and get a big bang for your buck. But that doesn't mean where public opinion is going to end up in a week or two. I think you both mentioned the strength of these visuals, and we definitely react to people struggling to get their safety, find some kind of safety in the airplane places. Those visuals are incredibly powerful. But I also can't avoid the irony of people start switching positions regardless of what they used to say on the topic. So if you look back and see where Donald Trump was on this, speaking both about some of the Taliban leaders at one point, and certainly talking about getting the ball rolling to get us out and that's going to be too big a force to stop. And now he's talking, obviously, just the opposite, as are many of his colleagues in Congress. I mean, we've gone through a situation not too long ago where families were being separated and kids were being pulled apart from their parents, and that was over the immigration from Mexico. That was, chastised by one group and ignored by the other. Now we've got the opposite situation where apparently sometimes that's okay and sometimes it's not. So, I mean, there is the irony in all that.
Two things I wanted to mention real quick. One is that in these most recent polls, Lee, I think it's an excellent point. These polls are happening in the midst of this. I don't think they tell us very much other than where people are thinking at that moment. The unsures in the YouGov poll are almost as high as the yes and no. And I think unsures in a moment like this are people who are unsure. And so I think that's really worth noting, that unsures at 31% are unsure of what to think, whether it's a mistake or not. I think says a lot. And the other thing is the trend. And Gallup's been asking a question about whether Americans think it's a mistake for America to be in Afghanistan. And while that number, the number of Americans who've thought it was a mistake, has twice, including most recently, barely surpassed those who think it's not a mistake, for the most part, Americans have thought it's not a mistake, but by a pretty small margin, a thin margin over the last few years. That's not the same question that's been asked by others about whether Americans believe troops should be coming home. And for more than a decade now, in most polls, a majority of Americans have said it's time to bring the troops home. So I think that's important to note as well.
Yeah, I think there's an insight into Biden and how he acts and how the Biden administration, during the first 6 months, obviously everything's magnified. Certainly that's now the case in foreign policy, where we're looking to see how, Tim Russert used to say that politics is not all that complicated. You say you're going to do it, you do it, and then you say you've done it. And the thing about the Biden administration is they sort of wait till things form a little bit, and then he tries to kind of restate what his policy was and what's going on and where he's going from here. He seems a little slow to the uptake. And I think he lets the story get away from him a little bit to his political detriment. Now, that may be rational and it may be smart policy, but I think he lets the political opposition, kind of get the first, salvo in before he tries to clarify.
See if you think that in 2 weeks, though. I mean, I think this is just moving so quickly, and I don't know, Barb. You've been trying to jump in, and we've been hijacking you.
Well, no. I mean, just a couple things, and one is that I think there is a real difference between, particularly in the role of polling, to take a snapshot of where public opinion is, and then to also try to get an understanding of where policy should be. And unfortunately, those lines blur. And when you have events that are moving as quickly as they are in this instance, and we've seen this, in other cases as well, certainly we can, get a gut reaction to things. But I think in terms of governing, for any president, I think it's important to, think less about the news cycle and to think more about the long-term policy. And so I think in this case, as you guys are pointing out, a little breather, a step back would be wise.
Well, Barb, you've always been our census person among the trio, and
she makes the most census of any of us.
Oh, I'm glad we have that one recorded. I will definitely be able to use that comment in the future. But yeah, the numbers are now starting to dribble out. We've talked about all the difficulty and all the problems with the 2020 census, but it is definitely showing a number of changes that have occurred in the United States over the last decade. And one in particular is that we have seen America is becoming more diverse and multiracial than it has been ever before. In this particular census, people of color represent 43% of the total US population, compared to 34% in 2010. So what are some of the implications of that change? We've talked about it in our, we've seen this change in registration, we've seen it in voting, we've seen it in geography. Start somewhere.
Yeah, well, I'll start at the sort of where we are right now, and that is get ready for some redistricting, because that's what the census does, among many important things. It shapes where the population is, so where you have to think about where to put the congressional district lines and state lines. It doesn't mean you follow the population, but the overall shift. So Texas had some significant growth, and you will see that in the next presidential election, where the electoral count and certainly the number of congressmen in the next election will have increased, I believe, by 2. I could be wrong on that. I think it was 2. I remember when I was a kid, way back when, New York had 45 electoral votes because we had so many people, and now we're in the 20s.
And it's not because we have fewer people, it's because the rest of the country has grown faster than New York.
Growing at a quicker rate, yeah.
I think there's a couple of really interesting things in here, Barb, that you had kind of hinted at. And there's this growth in the number of people calling themselves people of color. One of the things that's been pointed out by researchers is that part of that almost certainly has to do with the fact that the census asked the question differently and allowed people to choose where they categorize themselves in terms of race and heritage. And so more people had the opportunity to choose mixed race or multicultural or whatever this was. And that there's been a lot of talk that accounts, at least for some of this, that the actual number of people of color didn't go from 34% to 43%, as much as the categories changed somewhat, allowing for Americans to express themselves in a more nuanced and a more meaningful way. The other thing that strikes me, especially somebody who has lived in an urban area for most of their lives and now lives in the sticks, is that this is not only becoming a more multicultural country, it's rapidly becoming a more urban country. And the rural areas are emptying out, and the populations are moving to the cities and to a lesser degree to the suburbs, but it does make the suburbs more interesting when it comes to politics, because they become even more a centerpiece of how this redistricting plays out, I think.
So, we have seen this very significant difference between urban, there we go, herbal voters, which, that's America. We're urban and rural, so we're all herbal.
You just created a whole new thing like soccer moms. Now you have the herbal population shift.
But unfortunately,
the herbal voters.
Unfortunately, they are an opposite, spectrum, sides of the political spectrum. And so as we see this movement, is our politics going to follow that? Or what are really you talked about redistricting, but with the population growth does seem to favor the Democrats overall, but the geography significantly favors the Republicans.
So it's a battlefield. The battle lines are drawn because the Democrats increasingly are doing worse in the areas that are shrinking, or at least becoming less relatively large, and now are trying to break into the Sun Belt, where they have successfully done in some Senate and presidential areas elections. And that's a movement of necessity, because that's where the votes are going to be increasingly. But we're hearing a lot about voter suppression, and we're hearing about all kinds of efforts to affect the congressional district lines. And we're going to see a lot of that in the next 6 months, as people are going to see new district lines drawn, and then people objecting to the fact that those may be discriminatory or partisan in some way. Redistricting is not a new partisan part of our politics, but certainly it's going to one that's going to take front and center as these census numbers, which we've been talking about for months, now enter into the political reality of what do they do for the actual district lines in terms of the next congressional elections.
I had one other thing and then one question for you, Barb. I think it's really interesting that the adult population has grown over the last 10 years by 10%, but under 18 has shrunk by a smaller amount. We're getting older. We're having fewer kids. The country is aging. And I think that's almost as interesting, if not as interesting, especially for the long-term health of Social Security and some of the benefits entitlement programs, as the multicultural nature. The question I have is, how does this impact polling? Because I think most people don't recognize that the census, without the census, we probably couldn't do our jobs.
It'd be certainly a lot more difficult, because what we want to do as pollsters is we want to be able to look at the samples that we draw scientifically and hopefully represent the population of the adult population of the US. But it's what we really need as well are some parameters to basically say, did we get it right or didn't we? We can use elections to get a sense of, whether our results are right or not. But overall, it's also important to know whether we have the correct demographic makeup. And so, yes, we do use the census and all these different parameters. When you mentioned the question wording that has changed in the census, that certainly also impacts how we need to be collecting information from individuals when we are surveying them. So we can try to match how the census did that as well, so that we can see whether in fact we are being inclusive and representative as Americans as a whole. I think one of the interesting things too, though, that you mentioned, Jay, with this aging of America, is the fact also that although the US population did grow, I think it was a little over 7% over this past decade, it's been noted that it is one of the slowest population growths that we have had since the early to mid part of the previous century, the decade of 1930 to 1940. And I think it probably remains to be seen whether what the implications of that are, and whether and how how real that is. Is that part of the missing count because of the difficulty that we had during the pandemic, or is that something that is actually going to be a change for the U.S. and have much slower growth, particularly with the immigration policies that we have seen in the past administrations?
With that, it's time for fun fact.
Yay!
And let me point out that we've wanted to get fun facts from a longer time ago, and our crack team came up with one from 1950, which was I guess it was a census year also, and that was seven censuses ago. Well, I don't know if that's the plural of the census, but anyway. Censi. Anyway, 1950, and we found one that actually predates me, and was done by Gallup.
And that's the real challenge. We had to find a poll that predates you. Yeah. So
yeah. Just polling that existed prior to me is hard sometimes to locate, I guess. But anyway, so 1950, Gallup asked, what would you say is your pet peeve? What annoys you the most? Now, as we've seen when we've gone back in time, very often the wording is also reflective of some cultural differences that existed in the way we just saw the world. So here's what people said at that point. The number one was inconsiderate, disagreeable types of people. And I can see that as still probably being high on the list, but this was 1950. Some people thought the war. Family annoyances was in third, with 4% saying my husband, my wife, my son, housework, and all that kinds of things.
Oh, that's in fourth. You missed second place, which I think is interesting too, because second place probably also still is something that would be a pet peeve of a lot of people.
Yeah, so up at the top, government practices, policies, personalities, high on the list. Then we get down to some of the lower ones. traffic drivers, including women drivers, which I think is sort of well, let's just say it's entertaining. What I didn't see on here, and everybody get tense, I didn't see fellow workers, which I wonder why that's missing. But 20%, and this is very time specific, but 20% said, I don't have a particular peeve or I can't think of any. Gosh, we're
No, 13%, Lee. Okay, they're 13%.
Well, he
no
added up
particular.
and can't think of any.
Oh, sorry, you're right, and can't think of any. Okay.
Yeah, so I got 1 in 5 Americans without a pet peeve. I'm not.
Do we use is pet peeve? Is that a phrase anymore?
I don't know. I think this was open-ended, clearly, because these are groups of answers. I think this would be really interesting to ask again. We couldn't do a trend because you can't get it perfect, but I think it would be really interesting because I bet that people people you don't like would be up there. Government would be up there. Family annoyances would be up there.
Fellow workers, Jay would be up there.
What are you
kidding.
saying? Is this me?
Just kidding.
What's he on?
I'm surprised, like, bad grammar isn't there.
Okay, so that's your. Okay, so let's go around, and we've got our production assistants and our editing supervisor on. So Lee, what's your pet peeve? What's your biggest pet peeve?
My pet peeve are obstinate people who don't listen to reason.
Okay, so that's in that first. That's the first place.
Wow!
Barb, what's
Wow! Well, yeah, bad grammar.
Bad grammar. Okay.
Bad grammar. That's absurd. First of all, how do you know when you're speaking it?
Casey, what's your pet peeve? Biggest pet peeve?
It's all fun and games until I enter my car. So
anything to do with the car, but not women drivers, right? That's not what.
No, all drivers are bad.
All drivers. Ashley, what's the thing that annoys you most?
My biggest pet peeve is when people interrupt each other and it just keeps happening, and it's like,
oh, just stop on that. That's a ridiculous pet peeve.
That never happens here. How can you produce this show and have that be your pet peeve? I don't know how your head doesn't explode, but anyway. Marcello.
And we also, well, hang on. We just might also add that Ashley is filling in for Mary Griffith as our producer for a little bit of time now, because Mary is now out on maternity leave, and we have welcomed a new MIPO member, Gianna Elaine Griffith. Has been welcomed into the world,
and everybody's doing well. Everyone
is doing very well.
And the two brothers, older brothers, seem to be welcoming their younger sister, which is very important. There were some doubts as to that occurring, but it's totally working out just great. The Fantastic Five, the Fab Four became the Fantastic Five.
But thank you, Ashley. We appreciate you stepping in while Mary's away. And now for Marcello's.
Excuse me, Barb. Everybody knows I intentionally was interrupting Ashley, right?
Yes.
Okay.
But you did that anyway, so.
I know that.
We're on episode 210, Lee. If our listeners don't know that wasn't intentional, then they haven't been listening. Marcello, what's your pet peeve? Biggest pet peeve?
Mine sounds petty, but when people mess up my orders, like for food, just because I get so excited sometimes, and then when there's no pickles on my burger, it
ruins your day. Well, but that is that's what pet peeves really are.
Can I get back on? Oh, Jay, go ahead, and I get last word here.
Yeah. So and then we've got to end. This is not the endless episode. That's my pet peeve when we don't end the show. No. So mine is very much a New York City thing, and it's people who don't know how to walk. In New York, and anybody who's ever lived in New York gets this, people who are walking down the street and they're going one direction, then they just stop, or they slow down and turn, or they don't know where they're going. Even worse than drivers, it's kind of like, I guess, if you live in LA or a city where you drive a lot, it's basically the New York City version of that, but because we mainly walk and we don't drive, it's walkers. And that's my pet peeve is people.
Sounds like you need a horn.
Okay.
Sounds like you need a horn.
Oh, I got one, but
So you don't have road rage, you have walking rage.
Yeah, exactly. Sidewalk rage.
Sidewalk rage.
All right, so I left out my real two pet peeves. one, Marcel, you led me to this. When you're at a restaurant and the waiter comes by and says, "Is everything okay so far?" And I always think when they say "so far," like I haven't bitten into the cyanide tablet yet. Yeah, everything's okay so far. And then the other thing is that people will say, and everybody who works with me knows this is my pet peeve. People will say the expression, "I just mean to say," and then they'll say it. And I just say, don't just say you just mean to say it, just say it. And that's what we try to do on Poll Hub. And how's that for a rough segue? Until next time.
I think that's good. No, and I think Mary will listen to this and say, "Oh, I see. They don't change when I'm away. They can't end the show even when I'm there or whether I'm away. It's the same."
And that's going to do it for this edition of Poll Hub. Poll Hub is a production of the Marist Poll at Marist College in Poughkeepsie, New York. I'm Mary Griffith and Poll Hub's executive producer. Casey Schaff is our production supervisor. Ashley Marcinek is our production assistant, and Marcello Bettman is our trusted editor. Thanks to the Roper Center Archive at Cornell University. They provide us with the ability to look back at survey questions and results over the decades. If you have questions or comments, reach out to us on social media. We're at Marist Poll on Twitter and Marist Poll on Facebook and Instagram. And while you're at it, check out our free series of short online learning modules. The Marist Poll Academy can be found on maristpoll.com. Finally, if you like what you hear on Poll Hub, please consider leaving a review on your podcasting app of choice. Positive reviews help others find us. And while you're at it, go ahead and subscribe. Thanks for joining us. We'll catch you back here next week.